This is private property! Go away!
We are United States Army soldiers, requesting emergency shelter.
The veteran lived in seclusion for many years, until 10 female soldiers came asking for shelter. The mountain wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the isolated cabin where Colonel Sarah "Iron" Mitchell had lived in self-imposed exile for 8 years. Her only companions, the ghosts of decisions that had cost lives, and the bitter memories of a military career that had ended not in honor, but in controversy. At 55, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect from thousands of soldiers, but her weathered hands and hollow eyes told the story of a woman who had chosen isolation over the pain of human connection. The cabin that stretched across 50 acres of Colorado wilderness was her fortress against a world that had judged her harshly, where she had buried her past along with her faith in the institution she had served for 30 years. But tonight, as 10 desperate female soldiers appeared through the blizzard at her door, exhausted, hunted, and with nowhere else to turn, she would face a choice that would either confirm her belief that she was better off alone or prove that redemption sometimes came disguised as the very responsibility she had tried to escape. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments when we choose to open our hearts to those who need us most. The blizzard that swept across the Colorado Rockies was the worst in a decade, with winds reaching 70 miles per hour and snow falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet. Through this white hell, 10 figures struggled up the mountain path toward the only shelter for miles, a cabin whose owner had spent 8 years avoiding exactly this kind of human contact. Colonel Sarah "Iron" Mitchell stood at her window watching the storm through glass that hadn't been cleaned in months. Her reflection showing a woman who had once commanded the respect of entire battalions, but now couldn't bear to look herself in the eye. The Distinguished Service Medal gathering dust on her mantle was a reminder of everything she had lost when her final mission went catastrophically wrong. But the 10 women struggling through the storm toward her door would force her to confront the question she had been avoiding for 8 years, whether the leader who had once inspired unwavering loyalty in her troops still existed beneath the bitter shell of the woman who had chosen exile over accountability. The Rocky Mountain wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, a landscape so remote that the nearest town was a 3-hour drive on good roads. And tonight, with the blizzard raging, those roads were impassable death traps. Sarah's cabin sat at an elevation of 9,000 feet, accessible only by a narrow mountain path that she had deliberately left unmarked and unmaintained to discourage visitors. This was where she had come to disappear from a world that had branded her a failure, where the only sounds were wind through the pines and the occasional call of wildlife that had learned to avoid human contact. The isolation was complete and intentional. No internet, no cell service, no connection to the military community that had once been her entire life. But tonight, that isolation would be shattered by 10 women whose survival depended on finding shelter from both the storm and the enemies pursuing them. Sarah Mitchell had been born into a military family where service was not just expected, but demanded. Her father had been a career Marine, her brother a Navy SEAL, and she had chosen the Army with the determination to prove that women could lead in combat as effectively as men. For 28 years, she had done exactly that, rising through the ranks to become one of the youngest female colonels in Army history. Her reputation had been built on impossible missions accomplished through innovative tactics and unwavering dedication to her troops. The soldiers under her command had called her Iron, not because she was inflexible, but because she was unbreakable, the leader who would walk through fire to bring her people home safely. Her record was spotless, her decorations numerous, and her future in the military seemed limitless. But reputations built on perfection were fragile things, and Sarah's had shattered during Operation Desert Shield 8 years earlier. A mission to extract hostages from a terrorist compound had gone catastrophically wrong when intelligence failures led her team into a trap. 12 soldiers had died under her command, including her own daughter, Lieutenant Jennifer Mitchell, who had volunteered for the mission against her mother's wishes. The official investigation had cleared Sarah of wrongdoing, but the media coverage had been brutal, focusing on the nepotism of a mother commanding her daughter and questioning whether emotional attachment had clouded her tactical judgment. The Army had offered her a desk job and early retirement with full honors, but Sarah had chosen something else entirely, exile from the world that had defined her entire identity. The 10 women struggling through the blizzard toward Sarah's cabin represented more than just refugees seeking shelter. They were a test of whether the leader who had once inspired absolute loyalty still existed beneath the bitter shell of the woman who had chosen isolation over continued service. Their arrival would force Sarah to confront the fundamental question that had driven her into exile, whether her failure to save her own daughter meant she was unfit to be responsible for anyone else's life. The stakes extended beyond personal redemption to encompass the survival of 10 soldiers whose mission had gone wrong in ways that would remind Sarah of her own catastrophic failure. Their pursuers were closing in, the storm was worsening, and the nearest help was hours away, even under ideal conditions. Sarah would have to choose between maintaining the isolation that had protected her from further heartbreak or accepting responsibility for lives that hung in the balance. The pounding on Sarah's door came at 147 hours, cutting through the howl of the blizzard like gunfire. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. 8 years of isolation had taught her that human contact brought only pain and complications she was no longer equipped to handle. But the pounding continued, desperate and rhythmic, the sound of people who knew that the storm could kill them if they didn't find shelter soon. Sarah approached the door with a tactical awareness that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. Her hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm she still kept loaded, despite having no enemies left to fight. Through the frosted window, she could make out shapes huddled against the storm, multiple figures in military gear, their faces obscured by the driving snow. "Ma'am," came a voice from the other side of the door, speaking with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "We're U.S. Army personnel requesting emergency shelter. We have wounded and we're being pursued by hostile forces." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing back memories of similar requests she had made during her own desperate moments in hostile territory. These weren't casual hikers caught by the storm. They were soldiers in trouble, and every instinct she had developed over 30 years of service demanded that she help them. Sarah's strategy was simple: assess the threat, provide immediate aid, and get the soldiers back to safety as quickly as possible without becoming emotionally invested in their situation. She had learned the hard way that caring too much about the people under her protection led to devastating mistakes, and she couldn't afford to repeat the errors that had cost her daughter's life. Her preparation was methodical and professional. She secured her weapons, activated the emergency protocols she had established for exactly this kind of situation, and mentally reviewed the medical supplies and defensive positions available in the cabin. The building had been designed as a fortress as much as a home, with reinforced walls, multiple escape routes, and enough supplies to withstand a siege. But as she opened the door and saw the 10 women standing in the storm, their uniforms torn and bloody, their faces showing the exhaustion of people who had been running for their lives, Sarah felt something she had thought was dead stirring in her chest. These weren't just soldiers seeking shelter. They were someone's daughters, sisters, and friends, and they were looking at her with the same trust and desperation that her own troops had once shown. The leader in her wanted to take charge immediately to assess their injuries and tactical situation while planning their next move. But the broken woman, who had spent 8 years in exile, whispered that getting involved would only lead to more death and more guilt that she couldn't bear to carry. Sarah's first glimpse of the 10 soldiers confirmed her worst fears. These weren't just refugees from the storm, but combat veterans who had been through hell and were still being hunted by enemies who wouldn't be deterred by weather or terrain. Their leader, a captain who couldn't have been more than 28, stepped forward with the bearing of someone who had learned to command under fire. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Lisa Rodriguez, 82nd Airborne. My team was conducting a classified operation when we were compromised. We've been evading pursuit for 36 hours, and we have 3 wounded who need immediate medical attention." The professional assessment was delivered with the kind of crisp efficiency that Sarah recognized from her own younger days, but she could see the desperation beneath the captain's controlled exterior. These women had been pushed to their limits, and they were looking to her for the kind of leadership she was no longer sure she could provide. "How did you find this place?" Sarah asked, her tactical mind already working, despite her emotional reluctance to get involved. "Intel said there was a former Army colonel living up here," Rodriguez replied. "Someone who might understand what we're dealing with and be willing to help soldiers in trouble." The words carried an implicit challenge that Sarah couldn't ignore. Would she live up to the reputation that had preceded her? Or would she prove that her exile had been justified by her unwillingness to accept responsibility for other people's lives? The first phase of Sarah's reluctant involvement came when she was forced to treat the wounded soldiers her medical training, overriding her desire to maintain emotional distance. The injuries were serious: 2 gunshot wounds and a severe concussion, requiring skills she hadn't used since her active duty days. As she worked, the soldier stories began to emerge, revealing a mission that had gone wrong in ways that reminded her painfully of her own final operation. Captain Rodriguez's team had been tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a terrorist compound, but they had walked into a trap that had cost them half their unit. The parallels to Operation Desert Shield were impossible to ignore, and Sarah found herself reliving the decisions that had led to her daughter's death while trying to keep these women alive. The second phase brought the realization that their pursuers were closing in despite the storm. Rodriguez's communications equipment had been damaged, leaving them unable to call for backup or coordinate with friendly forces. Sarah's cabin, which had been her sanctuary for 8 years, was about to become a battlefield where the tactical decisions she made would determine whether 10 more soldiers lived or died. The third phase introduced the psychological challenge of command responsibility that Sarah had spent 8 years trying to escape. The soldiers were looking to her for leadership, their trust evident in the way they deferred to her experience and waited for her orders. But accepting that responsibility meant risking the kind of emotional investment that had destroyed her when her daughter died under her command. The pressure intensified when Sarah's monitoring equipment detected multiple heat signatures moving up the mountain despite the blizzard conditions. The enemy force pursuing Rodriguez's team was larger and better equipped than she had expected, with the kind of resources that suggested government backing rather than simple terrorist organization. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The storm that had initially provided cover for the soldiers' escape was now trapping them in a location that could be easily surrounded and assaulted. Sarah's cabin, while defensible, was not designed to withstand a coordinated attack by professional military forces. More challenging was the psychological pressure of watching 10 soldiers place their faith in her leadership, despite knowing nothing about the failure that had ended her career. Their confidence was both inspiring and terrifying, reminding her of the trust that her own troops had placed in her before she had led them into disaster. The weight of command responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Every decision she made would have consequences for lives that weren't hers to risk. But the alternative was abandoning soldiers who had nowhere else to turn for help. The breakthrough in Sarah's emotional walls came when the youngest soldier, Private Maria Santos, asked her directly about the medals and commendations displayed in the cabin. Instead of deflecting or changing the subject, Sarah found herself telling the story of her military service and the mission that had ended it. "I lost 12 soldiers on my last operation," she said, her voice steady despite the pain the admission caused. "Including my own daughter. The investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, but that doesn't change the fact that they died because of decisions I made." The soldier's response surprised her. Instead of losing confidence in her leadership, they seemed to understand that her guilt was evidence of the kind of commander who cared about her troops rather than just completing missions. Captain Rodriguez spoke for the group when she said, "Ma'am, the fact that you still carry that responsibility shows exactly why we need you to help us now." The moment of connection was both healing and terrifying for Sarah, who had spent 8 years believing that caring about soldiers under her command was a weakness that led to fatal mistakes. But these women were showing her that the opposite might be true, that leadership without emotional investment was what led to real failure. The situation escalated dangerously when Sarah's perimeter alarms detected the enemy force had reached the base of the mountain and was beginning their assault, despite the continuing blizzard. The attackers were using military-grade equipment and tactics that suggested they were not ordinary terrorists, but professional soldiers operating under government authority. Sarah's defensive preparations were immediately put to the test when the first probing attacks began, with sniper fire and reconnaissance drones testing their positions and capabilities. The cabin's reinforced construction provided some protection, but it was clear that a sustained assault would eventually overwhelm their defenses. The psychological pressure intensified when Sarah realized that the enemy force was using the same tactics she had encountered during Operation Desert Shield, suggesting that the intelligence failure that had doomed Rodriguez's mission might be connected to the same network that had betrayed her own operation 8 years earlier. The convergence of past and present created a crisis of confidence that threatened to paralyze Sarah at the moment when decisive leadership was most needed. The soldiers were looking to her for the kind of tactical brilliance that had made her legendary, but she was haunted by the knowledge that her last attempt at tactical innovation had resulted in catastrophic failure. The storm was worsening, their ammunition was limited, and the enemy was closing in with overwhelming force. Sarah would have to choose between the safety of continued isolation and the dangerous path of accepting responsibility for lives that hung in the balance. The disaster struck at 0347 hours when the enemy force launched a coordinated assault that shattered the illusion of safety that Sarah's cabin had provided for 8 years. Explosions rocked the building as rocket-propelled grenades struck the reinforced walls, while automatic weapons fire shattered windows and sent deadly fragments of glass and wood flying through the interior spaces. The attack was precisely coordinated and devastatingly effective, revealing that the enemy had been observing the cabin for hours and had identified its defensive weaknesses with professional thoroughness. Sarah's carefully planned defensive positions were compromised within minutes, forcing her and the 10 soldiers to retreat to the cabin's basement while the building burned above them. But the physical destruction was nothing compared to the psychological catastrophe that Sarah faced as she watched history repeat itself in the most brutal way possible. The tactical situation was identical to Operation Desert Shield, outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a defensive position that was rapidly becoming untenable. The faces of the soldiers looking to her for salvation were the same expressions of trust and desperation that her daughter had worn in the final moments before the explosion that had killed her. Private Santos was critically wounded in the initial assault, her blood pooling on the basement floor as Sarah worked frantically to stabilize her condition. The sight of another young soldier dying under her command triggered a psychological breakdown that threatened to paralyze her at the moment when leadership was most desperately needed. The parallels to her daughter's death were impossible to ignore. The same tactical mistakes, the same intelligence failures, and the same devastating consequences for soldiers who had trusted her to bring them home safely. The moment of truth came when Captain Rodriguez forced Sarah to confront the choice that would define not just the next few hours, but the rest of her life. The basement was filling with smoke from the fires above, their ammunition was running low, and the enemy was preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm their remaining defenses. Colonel Rodriguez said, using Sarah's former rank for the first time, "We need you to make a decision. We can surrender and hope they take us prisoner, or we can fight our way out and try to reach the extraction point. But we need a leader, not someone who's paralyzed by guilt over something that happened 8 years ago." The words cut through Sarah's psychological defenses like a blade, forcing her to confront the fundamental question that had driven her into exile, whether her failure to save her daughter meant she was unfit to be responsible for anyone else's life, or whether that failure had taught her lessons that could save the soldiers who were depending on her now. The internal conflict that followed was the most intense of Sarah's life. She could accept that her time as a leader was over and surrender to the enemy, preserving the lives of the 10 soldiers while confirming her belief that she was too damaged to command. Or she could embrace the responsibility that had once defined her identity and risk repeating the mistakes that had cost her daughter's life. "Rodriguez," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the authority that had once inspired unwavering loyalty from thousands of soldiers. "I'm going to get you out of here, all of you, but I need you to trust me one more time, even though trusting me got my last unit killed." The admission of her failure was also an acceptance of responsibility that marked the beginning of her transformation from broken exile to the leader these soldiers needed her to be. The decision that would define everything came when Sarah chose to implement a tactical plan that was even more dangerous than the one that had failed during Operation Desert Shield. Instead of trying to fight their way to safety through superior enemy forces, she would use the burning cabin as a diversion while leading the soldiers through a mountain pass that was barely navigable under ideal conditions and potentially suicidal in a blizzard. "We're going to use the storm as cover," she told the assembled soldiers, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her purpose again. "The enemy expects us to either surrender or try to fight our way down the mountain. They won't expect us to go up through terrain that should be impossible to traverse in these conditions." The plan required the kind of calculated risk-taking that had made Sarah legendary during her active duty years, but it also demanded the kind of emotional investment in her soldiers' survival that had led to her daughter's death. She was choosing to care about these women despite knowing that caring made failure more devastating. "Are you with me?" she asked, looking each soldier in the eye. The unanimous response was immediate and unwavering. "Yes, ma'am." The preparation for their escape required Sarah to draw upon every skill she had learned in 30 years of military service while confronting the emotional barriers that had kept her isolated for 8 years. She divided the soldiers into teams based on their capabilities and injuries, assigned responsibilities for equipment and wounded personnel, and briefed them on a route through the mountains that would test their endurance and determination to their absolute limits. The plan was audacious and dangerous, requiring them to traverse a mountain pass in whiteout conditions while carrying wounded soldiers and evading pursuit by professional military forces. But it was also their only chance of survival, and Sarah's confidence in its feasibility was based on intimate knowledge of terrain that she had explored during 8 years of solitary hiking. The emotional preparation was even more challenging than the tactical planning. Sarah had to overcome not just her own doubts about her fitness for command, but the psychological barriers that had kept her from forming emotional connections with other people since her daughter's death. These 10 soldiers were asking her to care about their survival, and caring meant accepting the possibility of devastating loss. As they prepared to leave the burning cabin, Sarah felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders, but this time, instead of feeling like a burden, it felt like coming home. The escape began at 04:30 hours, with the soldiers moving in single file through snow that was knee-deep and wind that threatened to knock them off their feet with every step. Sarah led the way using GPS coordinates and terrain features that were barely visible in the storm to navigate a route that existed more in her memory than on any map. The enemy force was in pursuit within minutes, their thermal imaging equipment allowing them to track the soldiers' heat signatures despite the blizzard conditions. The chase that followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played across terrain that was treacherous, even for experienced mountain climbers, with the added complication of wounded soldiers who slowed their progress and left blood trails that their pursuers could follow. The tension reached its peak when Private Santos, already critically wounded, collapsed from blood loss and hypothermia at the most exposed section of the route. Sarah faced the commander's nightmare, the choice between abandoning a wounded soldier to save the rest of the unit or risking everyone's lives in an attempt to save one person. The decision she made would determine not just Santos's fate, but whether Sarah had truly learned from the mistakes that had cost her daughter's life. The moment that defined Sarah's redemption came when she made the choice that her younger self would never have considered. Instead of trying to save Private Santos through heroic individual action, she trusted her soldiers to work as a team while she provided the leadership and coordination they needed to succeed. Rodriguez Chen established a defensive perimeter. She ordered, her voice cutting through the wind with the authority of someone who had found her confidence again. Martinez Santos needs immediate medical attention. Stabilize her for transport. Everyone else prepare to move on my signal. The approach was methodical and professional, using the combined skills of the entire unit rather than relying on Sarah's individual heroism. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had made her legendary during her active duty years, but tempered by the wisdom that had come from 8 years of reflecting on the consequences of command decisions. The enemy force was closing in their pursuit, hampered by the same conditions that made the soldiers' escape so difficult. But Sarah's knowledge of the terrain gave her team advantages that their pursuers couldn't match, allowing them to use the mountain itself as both weapon and shield. The confrontation that would determine everything came when the enemy force caught up with them at a narrow mountain pass where retreat was impossible and surrender would mean death for all of them. Sarah found herself in the same tactical situation that had destroyed her career 8 years earlier, outnumbered, outgunned, and responsible for soldiers whose lives depended on decisions she was no longer sure she was qualified to make. But this time, instead of trying to solve the problem through individual brilliance, Sarah relied on the collective expertise and determination of her soldiers. She coordinated their defensive positions while Rodriguez directed their fire-used Chen's communication skills to call for backup that might not arrive in time, and trusted Martinez's medical expertise to keep Santos alive despite her critical injuries. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her active duty years. Instead of the clean, tactical problems of conventional warfare, this was a desperate struggle for survival, fought in conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. The soldiers under her command fought with the kind of determination that came from absolute trust in their leader, while Sarah provided the kind of leadership that came from absolute commitment to their survival. The turning point came when Sarah realized that the enemy force was using the same flawed intelligence that had doomed Operation Desert Shield, suggesting that the network responsible for her daughter's death was still active and still betraying American soldiers. The knowledge gave her the motivation she needed to fight not just for the soldiers under her current command, but for all the soldiers who had died because of intelligence failures and command mistakes. The resolution came not through military victory, but through the arrival of rescue forces that Rodriguez had managed to contact, using Sarah's emergency communications equipment. The helicopter that appeared through the storm carried not just medical personnel and extraction capability, but validation that Sarah's leadership had succeeded in bringing her soldiers home alive. The evacuation was swift and professional, with the wounded soldiers receiving immediate medical attention while the enemy force retreated rather than risk engagement with superior forces. But for Sarah, the real victory was personal rather than tactical. She had accepted responsibility for other people's lives and succeeded in protecting them despite the psychological barriers that had kept her isolated for 8 years. As the helicopter lifted off from the mountain pass, Sarah looked back at the burning cabin that had been her refuge and realized that she was leaving more than just a building behind. The woman who had chosen exile over continued service was gone, replaced by someone who understood that leadership wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them and using that knowledge to serve others. Private Santos survived her injuries and would make a full recovery, while the other soldiers returned to their units with stories about the legendary Colonel Mitchell who had saved their lives when no one else could. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was the knowledge that she could care about soldiers under her command without being paralyzed by the fear of losing them. The immediate consequences of Sarah's return to active leadership extended far beyond the successful rescue of 10 soldiers to encompass a fundamental transformation in how she understood her own identity and purpose. The Army offered her reinstatement with full honors and a promotion to general. But Sarah chose something different, a consulting role that would allow her to train other commanders while maintaining the emotional connections that had made her effective. The cabin in the mountains was rebuilt, but this time as a training facility where military leaders could learn the kind of tactical thinking and emotional intelligence that Sarah had developed through success, failure, and redemption. The immediate impact of Sarah's successful mission extended far beyond the rescue of 10 soldiers to reshape how the military approached the psychological support and reintegration of experienced commanders who had suffered traumatic losses. Her story became a case study in resilience and redemption, demonstrating that even the most devastating failures could be transformed into wisdom that served others. The intelligence network that had betrayed both her daughter's mission and Rodriguez's operation was exposed and dismantled, preventing future betrayals that could have cost countless additional lives. Sarah's debriefing provided crucial information that led to the arrest of double agents and the implementation of new security protocols that protected classified operations. But more importantly, Sarah's return to active service inspired other veterans who had been struggling with guilt and isolation to seek help and consider returning to roles where their experience could benefit others. Her example proved that redemption was possible even after the most devastating failures, and that the wisdom gained from mistakes could be as valuable as the knowledge gained from successes. The long-term implications of Sarah's transformation extended far beyond individual redemption to influence military doctrine and leadership training throughout the armed forces. Her hybrid approach to command, combining tactical expertise with emotional intelligence and psychological resilience, became the foundation for new leadership development programs that prepared commanders for the complex challenges of modern warfare. The training facility that replaced her mountain cabin became a destination for military leaders from around the world who wanted to learn the kind of tactical thinking and emotional wisdom that Sarah had developed through her journey from success, through failure, to redemption. Her methods emphasize the importance of learning from mistakes rather than avoiding them, and of accepting responsibility for others' lives as a privilege rather than a burden. The soldiers she had rescued became leaders themselves, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about trust, teamwork, and the kind of leadership that inspired absolute loyalty. Captain Rodriguez was promoted to major and became one of Sarah's most effective instructors, while Private Santos recovered fully and chose to pursue a career in military medicine. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah's story became a symbol of the possibility of redemption and second chances, inspiring countless veterans and active duty personnel who were struggling with their own failures and doubts about their continued usefulness to their country. Sarah's personal transformation was complete and profound. The bitter, isolated woman who had spent 8 years in exile was replaced by someone who understood that her greatest value lay not in avoiding mistakes, but in learning from them and using that knowledge to serve others. Her relationship with her daughter's memory was transformed from a source of guilt into a source of motivation, driving her to ensure that other parents wouldn't have to experience the loss she had endured. The leadership skills that had once made her legendary were enhanced by the wisdom that came from failure and the emotional intelligence that came from confronting her own psychological barriers. The story of Sarah Mitchell and the 10 soldiers who found shelter in a mountain cabin became a testament to the power of redemption, the importance of accepting responsibility for others, and the possibility of transformation even after the most devastating failures. It proved that sometimes the greatest leaders are those who have learned from their mistakes and chosen to serve others despite the risk of future heartbreak. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments when we choose to open our hearts to those who need us most.